everybody, it's Nicholas, and today I will be going over the greatest candy treat that everyone has ever known, as far as how it was developed, how it's currently produced, where it's produced, and then there are some ethics that, of course, we do need to cover because not everything is hunky-dory when it comes to chocolate. But first, we need to talk about how chocolate came into being. Now, chocolate up to this point in the late 1700s, early 1800s, had basically been a very thick and very sometimes not always enjoyable drink. However, that all changed in 1828 when a Dutch chemist named Van Houten developed a process by which could reduce the amount of cocoa butter from roughly 53% to its current, as we know it, in 27 to 28%. What was left was always a cake that could be dehydrated and turned into a powder. Now, the development of this process allowed chocolate to be more easily produced by the masses. It also allowed for more of it to be produced, and then could also transfer to be made, help make solid chocolates. This would begin the beginning of the boom that we know of in chocolate production. Now, chocolate's expansion was already kind of ongoing by the time cocoa powder was developed, but cocoa powder definitely helped accelerate the process. The earliest success in chocolate production was actually in England by J.S. Fry and Sons, was one of the first companies. However, Cadbury and several others all were in competition by this point in England. And it was founded in late, now J.S. Fry and Sons was founded in the late 1700s, and it was a very large leader in the creation of chocolate beverages and other treats. Now, once cocoa powder was developed, this allowed them to sell even more, and they started actually creating processes to mix sugar and melted cocoa butter back into the mix to create a paste. Now, this paste could be molded, and by 1847, we had the world's first chocolate bar. Thank you, J.S. Fry and Sons. Though the bar was initially extremely expensive and was basically only available to the mercantile class and the upper class, competition from other companies, once they figured out how to do this, like Cadbury and most of those other companies that I just talked about, were able to stop encouraging competition, which brought the prices down, which of course made chocolate more available to everybody else in the world. Now, there are a couple other things that occurred in Europe in the 1800s that helped chocolate continue to expand, and most of us have probably heard about Swiss chocolate. Well, Switzerland is in a very unique situation, being in the center of Europe and also being a very active trading nation, and also having a lot of dairy cows. 1849, Henry Nestle, we all probably know that name, developed the process to make powdered milk. Now, originally, this was more to be able to help out infants, to give people availability to milk that didn't necessarily have cows all around them. And this allowed for basically dehydrated milk to be available for everybody else. It wasn't until 1879 that Daniel Peter actually came up with the idea of combining those two and created the milk chocolate that we all know and love today. Now, further in 1879, also in Switzerland, Rudolf Lindt, who, oh, by the way, that company still makes chocolate. I'm actually eating some right now. It's amazing. Developed a conching machine. Now, the conching machine, what it does is it basically crushes and mixes all the stuff that you're trying to mix into chocolate into a much smoother mix. Up to this point, chocolate was sometimes a very rough, not necessarily smooth treat that everyone could enjoy because it did have, you have pockets of cocoa bean or whatever. The conching process, depending on how long you run the process for, actually smoothed out the chocolate and made it more enjoyable for everybody to eat. This also created the industrialization process because you could mix a lot of material together and create a lot of chocolate liquor which allowed for the increase in production. And again, this was 1879 in Switzerland. However, no story about chocolate is complete without Milton Hershey. Now, Milton Hershey was originally an apprentice in his teenage years of a confectionery store. And he learned all about making candies and probably watched as chocolate was being developed when it was actually the developments were being made. Now, later, he opened his own caramel candy store, but also sold chocolate coverings on caramel and all that other fun stuff. And it wasn't until he went to a expo in Chicago that he figured out how to get his hands on a conching machine, or several of them actually. Once he figured this out, he sold his store for approximately $1 million and bought a massive amount of property in Pennsylvania that we all now know as Hershey, Pennsylvania. What he used in this factory with these conching machines was he built a factory to mass produce conching, and that's where Milton Hershey is sometimes called the Henry Ford of chocolate, because he developed the process by which we now know and love as far as mass producing chocolate. And he used this to literally build an empire. And this is no joke. When I put it in the wiki page, I was not kidding. This man built an empire. He owned the town. There was no town council. There was no city meetings. Everything was at his will. Now, actually, it wasn't that bad, though, because with this town and the surrounding dairy farms, he built property for his employees. He had a fire station going, private security. All of this stuff was built by him using the money, of course, he was getting from selling so much frickin' chocolate. But he wasn't just confined to the United States. He actually had sugarcane fields in Cuba up until about 1959 when Fidel Castro took over. He had sugarcane farms that would import the sugar to his factories. The outside dairy farms in the surrounding centers were all owned by him. This man literally pretty much built up that entire area because of his mass production style. Now, that leads me into our current state of affairs when it comes to producing chocolate. Now, we already know about the fruit that is grown from the cocoa tree, and we harvest the pulp and the beans out of those pods. Now, what happens is they ferment them, and then, of course, as you can see here, it dries out the beans. You get over to here, and as it goes down, then you roast them. Now, the roasting is somewhat of a trademark item. Some companies roast them longer, some companies roast them less. It just depends on the proprietary considerations that company wants to take in. Once they're done with that, they go into this process, the winnowing process, where the shells of the beans are removed. Now, those can be used for compost. And there's also a couple of little minor things they can be used for. Most of the time, they're used for compost. Then you end up left with the cocoa nibs. That goes into the grinding process, which works to try and smooth them out. And again, proprietary requirements will dictate how big they want the granules to be. Those granules are mixed with sugar and cocoa butter and then put into the conching machine that we talked about earlier. Now, again, this is another proprietary thing. Some companies will only do it for a couple of hours. Some will do it for days. It depends on what the company wants as far as the texture of the chocolate they're trying to produce. Once it's done with that, it goes into tempering, depending on what degrees they want to set it at. And then they will mold it into whatever shape they wish to do, because it's not just chocolate bars anymore. We have chocolate Easter bunnies. Cadbury has the Cadbury cream eggs, which, by the way, I love those things. All sorts of other confectionery treats that are made from this process. Now, chocolate currently is produced in, like we discussed earlier, the tropical regions. This is led no longer by Central America. In fact, for quite a while now, it's been led by African nations. Off the Ivory Coast, which, as you see here, produces around 37% of the world's cocoa. Ghana produces 21%, and Indonesia produces 11.2%. And then it's led up by some of these other countries. Fun fact, actually, there is a couple of cocoa farms in Hawaii, which are the only place in the United States where cocoa is grown. I wouldn't say naturally, but it is grown there for scientific research and maybe a couple of products. There is efforts underway to try and expand where cocoa is produced because it is a very hot commodity right now, largely because of what we're about to get into, chocolate consumption. Now, surprisingly, the United States doesn't lead this category. We're actually pretty far behind. So some of y'all need to bump up your eating amounts of chocolate, which trust me, I work on that all the time. But currently we're being beat out by Switzerland by almost double our amount because we're down here in 9th place. Germany is in 2nd. Ireland and the United Kingdom are fighting for 3rd. And then you have some other European nations, and Australia gets thrown in the mix because they love chocolate too. But this is pretty much where you see chocolate is being consumed is in the modern world, is in the developed world. However, China, India, and some other major developing nations are growing in their chocolate consumption, and this will lead into some other issues that we'll talk about in a second. But I would like to talk about probably one of the more important factors, cocoa content. White chocolate does not have much cocoa at all. So really it's not chocolate in my book, but hey, it's your thing if you want to call it white chocolate. Milk chocolate runs a roughly around 10 to 35%. I actually don't know how much is in Hershey's milk chocolate. Doesn't say it on the bag, but hey, you could probably look that up. But milk chocolate generally is 10 to 35%. The rest of it's fillers, which I'll get into how the fillers are kind of bad sometimes in a little bit. Dark chocolate, 60 to 80%, depending on how much flavor of the chocolate you want to focus on. The lower the percentage, the sweeter it is. The higher percentage, the more bitter it is, but the more intense the chocolate flavor is. My preference is around 70 to 75%. I have tried some of the 80s and higher, but they are fairly bitter, but it's still enjoyable depending on how you're enjoying it. So this leads me into ethics. Unfortunately, there is a chocolate, pun intended, but child labor is an issue when it comes to production of chocolate. It is still ongoing. It was a lot worse back in the 80s and the early 90s due to UN resolutions and massive public outcries. There has been a decrease in child labor in the production of chocolate. However, it's still ongoing. If you want a really good documentary to watch, this video clip right here could actually play. And there is a documentary titled The Dark Side of Chocolate that is between 29 and 49 minutes, depending on what part of the video you're going to focus on. And that goes over child exploitation and chocolate being grown in war zones. Pretty eye-opening. And there are companies, Hershey talked about the idea of reducing how much chocolate they get from child labor. They are trying to implement a process that will get rid of that by 2020. No true real promises, but they are working toward it. It is an industry process and going. So the next up is environmental impact. Now, this is something that is important considering the fact global climate change is definitely causing a lot of problems in the world and will continue to cause more, because when it comes to cocoa trees, despite the fact that the trees we know are actually grow better in the understory of the canopies from the bigger trees, trees and major rainforests, especially in Africa, are being clear cut or burned out to create space to grow the trees. Now this, of course, as we've learned early in the course, destroys a very important carbon sink that is used to help reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, yes, the cocoa tree can help reduce some of that sink, but it's not nearly as good as an old growth forest. So by doing this, they're releasing a ton of CO2 and they're actually destroying the environment that the trees are growing in, and a very critical environment for many endangered and very important species. Another issue is fertilizer. They use a lot of fertilizers to grow some of the trees because, again, the trees are not growing effectively because they're not being grown in their normal environment under the story of the canopy. So this runoff from the fertilizer is actually hurting the water quality in the area that it's in. Now, the last thing I want to go over is quality control. It also kind of goes into with the history of it. Because some of the fillers that some companies can use in chocolate, it can cause them to go bad. So it was especially bad in the 1800s, but it's gotten a lot better because as a result of all the negative publicity that chocolate got when it was utilizing fillers like yeast, even chalk was reported to being used as a filler. Nations like the United States and Britain began implementing food safety and quality control laws that forced the companies to actually put good stuff in the food. So while it's not as big an issue as it used to be, chocolate did help spur the process of creating food standards that we all know and love. So Cassandra's going to take over from here. She's going to go over the cultural influences of chocolate. If you guys have any questions, by all means, let us know. We will try to get those questions answered to you. And if you have nothing else, I will talk to y'all later.